Before the video properly begins, I believe it is important to educate yourself on what happened to this game's developers and their company. So I put 2 video links in the description that describe this debacle so much better than I ever could. And as someone who likes to think he has principles, it is important to know where your money goes sometimes. Also, I do think the entire situation is actually quite interesting despite being unfortunate in my eyes. And finally, Disco Elysium is a very mature game that directly depicts topics such as depression, suicide, mental illness, sexual assault, etc. So if any of those things make you uncomfortable, I would highly recommend caution for any video on the internet about this game. Alright, now with all that out of the way, Disco Elysium might just be the greatest RPG I've ever played.
You should pick that fat, juicy cigarette butt from the tray, light it up, and smoke the living shit out of it.
Disco Elysium also hurts my brain. A lot.
Nobody betrays your degeneracy.
Not with its gameplay loop or RPG systems, however. I find it complicated to simply talk about what it has to say. And unfortunately for me, what it has to say is about 90% of the experience. Disco Elysium is much more of a visual novel than a game, with an overwhelming majority of it consisting of dialogue boxes on the right hand side of the screen. This style is certainly not for everyone, hell it usually isn't for me, so I fully understand if someone gets turned off by it before even hearing a single line of dialogue. However, at the same time, the experience I had just engaging with all these text boxes was so unique, sincere, and magical that I can't help but think that despite its niche presentation, this game should be played by as many people as possible. Before I get any further, I should give this game the proper intro, the proper context it deserves. Disco Elysium is a political and social satire where you play as a detective attempting to solve a murder in a fictional city in a fictional yet not so different universe. Sounds fairly simple, right?
No!
For starters, the detective we slide into the shoes of drank so much alcohol the night before the game starts that he forgot everything. And before you're like, has to be an exaggeration, he literally forgot everything except for his ABCs. Then I learned that the murder I'm supposed to be solving is merely a symptom of a union strike in the ongoing class struggle of Martinez, which is a lawless, bombed-out district of Revachol, the fictional city that the game takes place in. And then once I started to actually investigate the case, I met so many insane, politically charged weirdos that I started to apply some of their ideas to my own broken psyche. And I'm just scratching the surface here, but I think you get the idea by this point. We're in a room full of shit and the only way out is to start eating. Luckily, we do have one good thing happening to us. We met Kim Kitsuragi, who is firmly in the S tier of best bro video game companions. It's not a contest, but honestly, besides that, this is going to be a slightly uphill battle. Alright, now we can get back to the fun part that keeps me up at night, the story. And because this is a visual novel, it should be clear that this is the main reason to be playing with this virtual toy. Disco Elysium's plot is dense. There's quite a bit to unpack, from political ideologies, social issues, all the way down to individual human struggles such as depression, alcoholism, suicide, all the stuff that makes Thanksgiving dinner a little bit awkward. And if I'm gonna be 100% honest here, I simply cannot do it justice by just describing it in a non-spoiler fashion while also trying to keep this video at a length and pace that I am comfortable with. Then you add to that I'm in fact not a writing expert by any means, I don't know what the hell a gerund is, and we have a recipe for failure. But if this game taught me anything, if I learned anything from my almost 30 hours of playtime, it's that failure is going to happen no matter what, and it's not the end, it has value to our overall human experience. It might also be hilarious, so might as well give it a try. At the most basic level, this story consistently made me laugh and think deep thoughts. When I stepped outside of the hostel, the first NPC I met was an ugly redheaded child who only referred to himself in the third person, was high on speed, and his only source of entertainment was throwing rocks at the corpse I was meant to be investigating.
The fuck? Does Kuno know what a rake is? Kuno's not a gardener.
To add further insult to injury, him and his friend constantly called me one of the gamer words.
Get lost,
I thought he and his friend were absolutely hysterical. And now before anyone says anything, I don't find the actual use of the slur funny, but in context of the game, the larger narrative, it works so well for me. This game has all types of foul language throughout, from your F's to your C's, yet the only word it takes to actively censor is this one. And these vulgar, high, damn near homeless children are the only characters that consistently use it. So just from the basic use of this offensive slur, it begged the question further in my mind. What kind of person actually uses a word like that regularly in their vocabulary? Then I asked, what could possibly put a child in a situation like this to begin with, to have their only source of entertainment be throwing rocks at a corpse while high on amphetamines? In just about every NPC interaction I had, I found a dynamic like this. Over-the-top insane levels of bullshittery to grab my attention, that then leads into a deeper thought about what could possibly make someone act or think like this. It's tonal whiplash to the highest degree, yet it works because of one simple principle. It all leads to the same commentary, the same satire. Now, if you showed this game to one of those people who have diluted the word woke to the point where it no longer has any meaning, I genuinely think their head would explode. Every ounce of this game is drenched in political or social commentary that, in my view, seems to be well informed and articulated, if a bit biased. It is certainly a left-leaning commentary. However, it presents itself in a way that wants more just to be heard and thought about rather than treated as gospel. It consistently takes the time to dunk on every ideology in the game in an effort to discuss how ideologies fail in the ways they do, how people get swept up in these ideologies, and how the human shortcomings associated with political systems lead to long-reaching consequences. I personally found the political messaging to be less, here's what you should think about the world, and more, we think it's important to have strong thoughts about how the world should be. Unless it's fascism.
Fuck no, baby!
However, I found the most poignant story beats came from the commentary on the human experience. The protagonist we find ourselves in the snakeskin shoes of is a pathetic loser, and I don't say that in a derogatory, this man only plays League of Legends all day type of way, but rather this man is a loser in the most destructive manner possible and needs serious help type of way. He has a myriad of clashing voices in his head, battling for control of his actions, ranging from, hey, you should avoid interfacing with your past to avoid mental anguish, to, hey man, we gotta go huff some jankum. And these voices battling in our heads double as our skills. And I'm gonna say it right now, I know for a goddamn fact I have not played an RPG that has interwoven its character building mechanics with its story as expertly as Disco Elysium. So every skill I decided to upgrade led to a warring voice in my head being strengthened, gaining more power to overshadow the others in dialogue. On the flip side, while interfacing with the story, clicking on what seems like normal dialogue could lead my character down a rabbit hole to develop some insane thoughts that kind of act like perks or loot that are used alongside my skills to develop my own version of this tortured detective. In my playthrough, I developed thoughts that made my version of this guy believe he was a superstar hobo cop, which gave me corresponding buffs and debuffs. And it was all gained through engaging with the dialogue. One of my favorite parts of this system is you can be a walking contradiction. You can adopt a communist ideology while also adopting an entrepreneurial hustle sigma male grind set, and the game will call you out on it. What speaks more to a commentary on the human experience than being able to build your character as a massive hypocrite because it's convenient? Actually, I did already mention the one thing I think speaks the most to the human experience.
The words have already left your mouth.
What did he say?
Failure is an inevitable facet of everyone's life. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Just the script itself, I restarted it about 3 times before settling on this one. Failure is also inevitable in just about every video game, especially in my experience. And most of the time, failure in games means I want to break every window in my neighborhood. In Disco Elysium, failure is a much more varied experience, kind of like in real life. There were obviously some failures that were not very pog, but there were plenty that were at the very least absolutely hilarious. Some failures would lead to unforeseen positives in my future, others pointed my attention to pathways I initially would have missed. And then on the flip side of that, I love that succeeding roles, winning, wasn't always good. For example, early on in the game, I succeeded in athletics check, and my success ended up ruining a game for some elderly gentlemen who were then more reluctant to socialize with me despite my asserted physical dominance. This dynamic led to 2 major things for me. Firstly, it actually made me pay attention to determine if a check was a good idea based on context, instead of just basing it off of how high the chance of success was. And secondly, I was encouraged to just go ahead and try a check, even if my corresponding skill was low, if it seemed like a good idea. Failure isn't just reflected in gameplay either, it lives in every facet of this game's vibrant world. Martinez is little more than a bombed out ghetto still suffering from the failure of a past communist revolution. An abandoned business plaza adorns the center of the waterfront, a reminder of businesses that couldn't survive the capitalist society we find ourselves in. Our protagonist is a man marred by substance abuse because he couldn't handle the failures of his forgotten life. All of this losing, this dire life we find ourselves in, it all ties into my favorite aspect of the roleplay. Can you overcome the failures of the world, your past and your present, to push on towards the future? In a world that seems to almost always be against you, how can you cope with existence?
You should totally sing karaoke here, the first chance you get. Your emotions need to be expressed. People need to know your vast, oceanic soul. You don't need booze to feel alive.
Yet despite all of the dour commentary and situations the game presents, all of the failure paves the way to the moments that I remember the most. Kim congratulated me on good police work. An old lady gave me a cute green pen when I listened to her history lessons. I helped some hooligan set up a baller nightclub. For all of the collective strife this game shows, what shines the most through the cracks is the amount of hope it still has for humanity. On an individual level, you might not be able to change the world, but if you take the time to roll with the punches, you might just save yourself. Then in saving yourself, you just might be able to change those around you. And if you change those around you, then that just might change the world. But you'll only be able to find out if you take the time to fail and learn that failure has more to teach than you should just give up. God damn, I love this game. Disco Elysium is such a special piece of art. They worked on this game in an abandoned building. The lead designer had alcoholism for years before working on this. These guys had never even made a video game before. They started with no money, and they started in a country with a low talent pool for devs. It was just them. And they decided to create a CRPG for PC. So even if the game got made, it's already incredibly niche. And yet, despite all this, here we are today. Disco Elysium is widely considered to be one of the greatest CRPGs ever made. And they made it in a cave with a box full of scraps. And it has its issues, sure. Limited gameplay, a mind-numbing amount of text at times, and enough backtracking in the endgame to make my W key scream out in pain. Please let it stop. But you know what? None of that shit matters to me. Disco Elysium is an incredibly well-written story that respected my intelligence to decipher its myriad of ideas under my own volition, and respected my agency as the player to actually let me make meaningful decisions in regard to both my character and the narrative. I felt like more of an active and respected participant playing this visual novel than most of the AAA spectacle-filled action-oriented titles that get released nowadays. But more than any of that, Disco Elysium is clearly a labor of true love from these developers. Every ounce of its characters, world, dialogue, and RPG mechanics is filled to the brim with so much soul and creativity that it's impossible to not feel their passion through the screen at every second. As someone who has mainly stayed in the AAA realm until recently, it's so refreshing to play games that were clearly made by creative and passionate developers instead of soulless corporate products that feel like they were thought of by a bunch of guys in suits rather than the people that actually get the job done. Disco Elysium might not have the graphics or the set pieces to compete with those, but it doesn't need them. Disco Elysium is one of the greatest video game stories ever written, wrapped inside a charming, soulful indie CRPG, and it pushes the agenda so far forward for video game storytelling. It's mind-boggling that this was made by just some broke nerds in Estonia. This is probably going to be one of the easiest recommendations I could ever give for a video game. I think everyone owes it to themselves to at least give this game a try, because just like them and you and everyone else on this blue-trapped bubble, Disco Elysium is simply a miracle.
You better not fucking think about ditching me for some shitty cum-stained bow tie!